All right, everyone, welcome to your next installment of World Civilizations 2. I just want to mention a couple things before I get started. First off, I do apologize if I just sort of randomly started off this lesson in the middle of a sentence. The new recording software I'm using, for some reason, will oftentimes just stick at 0 seconds for a while, then all of a sudden just skip to 7 or 10 seconds. So I never really know when it started recording. So I do apologize for that. Secondly, you may have noticed that, as I just said, I am using a new software to record this time. The reason for that is because Microsoft Teams, what I was using, wouldn't let me really play the video of YouTube videos, I've been told. So I'm going to try this one, see if that works a little bit better. If it doesn't, we'll come up with some other solution. Now, last week, as you hopefully remember, we discussed European involvement in colonizing the Americas, North and South America. Today, we're going to go a little bit to the other side of the world and look at the African states and how they were involved in the global slave trade and how that got started up. To get things started, as always, like I mentioned last week, we'll begin with the key terms. First, we have household slavery. Then we're going to look at chattel slavery, the two dominant slavery types during this time period. We'll look at trade forts, the Kingdom of Benin, and the Kingdom of Congo and Ndongo, or Dongo. I'm not really sure how to pronounce that, to be quite honest with you. I think I mentioned this last week, but if you haven't noticed, pronunciation is definitely not one of my strong suits. In the meantime, I also want to always remind you of upcoming assignments you'll have to deal with in the future. In case you don't already know, your first writing assignment is coming up at the time of you viewing this. It should be this Friday, September the 4th at 5 p.m. If you need any more information on what this assignment is and how to complete it, I put information on this in my last lecture from last week. You can also check the Writing Assignment 1 section on Moodle. The prompt, rubric, and submission area are all located right there. Also, your first content quiz will be coming up the next Friday, September 11th at 5 p.m. This will be located just in the weekly sections along with your other weekly assignments and recordings for that week, which should be week 3. Finally, your final essay thesis statement will be due at 5 p.m. That's one of the benchmark assignments I've assigned you to make sure you're working on your final essay throughout the entire semester. Now, while I'm discussing assignments, I want to give you just again a quick rundown of the Moodle course, and I emphasize quick, this will only be a minute, but I just want to make sure for hopefully the last time that everyone knows where all these types of things are going to be located throughout the rest of the semester. So, starting with writing assignment 1, you'll just pull up your course. I'm going to pull up the first section. Those of you who are in my second section of World Civilizations, your class should look exactly the same, so you should have no problem following along. So, here we are, World Civilizations 2. So, of course, you have your general welcome stuff, the office hours, syllabus, the citation guides. All that stuff will be there throughout the entire semester. Your Moodle orientation stuff is done. If all of you did your intro and your syllabus contract, you never have to worry about the Moodle orientation ever again. Now, your writing assignments and your major debate assignments, as I mentioned last week, are all located here at the very top of the classroom. I wanted them to be at the very top so you'd be able to be reminded of them every time you logged into Moodle, and you have their due dates right out here where you won't be able to forget them. So, for example, your upcoming writing assignment, like I said, it's due this Friday. The prompt, rubric, and the submission area are all located right here. You'll be able to see them the whole semester. However, do remember that this assignment will disappear. The submission area will disappear 4 days after the due date. If you don't get it in by then, don't bother trying to turn it in. The points will have gone down so much it won't matter anyway. So just again to remind you, all of your other major writing assignments and debates are located here as well. For example, here's your midterm essay. The prompt, rubric, and submission area are all located right here. Same thing for your debates. Voila, debate 2 prompt, the rubric, and your submission area. Now, finally, to explain a little bit of the final essay thesis statement, if you don't remember from last week, all of your final essay stuff is also located under the final essay tab. Your prompt and your rubric are right here. However, please don't forget, you have 3 benchmark assignments that are coming up over the rest of the semester that, again, are just going to help me gauge your progress on this project throughout the entire semester. If you want information on how to complete these, which, spoiler alert, you do want information on how to complete these, obviously, you're just check the final essay prompt, which I'll even pull up for you really quick, and it explains what you have to turn in throughout for these benchmark assignments throughout the entire semester. Then, of course, your prompt and more details are up here, but you should have looked at that by now on your own time. If you have any questions about it, please don't hesitate to ask me, and ask me as soon as possible. Finally, your content quiz. I do want to explain how that's going to look really quick. Just as a quick reminder, below all of your major assignments are your weekly tabs. This is, again, where your lectures, readings, and weekly assignments are going to be posted on a weekly basis. I haven't posted them yet because I'm actually recording this Sunday morning, but by the end of Sunday today, sometime this evening, I will have posted everything for week 2. But just to give you an idea of how this looks again, let's look over week 1. Your lectures are all here, your readings are all here, all of your assignments for the upcoming week are right here, and then your supplemental stuff that you can use for upcoming assignments are also down here. I would recommend mainly using these as extra evidence for some of your assignments coming up. Now, just to give you an example of how the content quiz will work, it's going to be due during week 3, so I will post it under learning activities right here. I haven't posted it yet, obviously, because it's still about 2 weeks off, but the Sunday before that week, I will post it, so you will have access to that. So, that should cover all the upcoming dates for the rest of this week, and really the rest of the semester, but please don't hesitate to ask if you have any questions about that. Now, moving forward with our lives. What I want to do before we really get into the slave kingdoms is to help make sure you're ready for this upcoming writing assignment and all of the ones in the future. Now, if you've looked at a rubric already, you know that one of the main things I look for when I grade these is a thesis statement. I want to have excellent thesis statements, as Qui-Gon Jinn informs you right here. If you don't know who Qui-Gon Jinn is, reflect on your life's priorities. In the meantime, these are the main things I look for when I grade a writing assignment. First off, I want a good thesis statement with a clear argument. I probably shouldn't have said I want a good thesis statement there. That's pretty self-explanatory. But what makes a thesis statement good for me especially is a clear argument. You're not making a summary with any of these writing assignments you have for me. You're going to be making some kind of argument where you're going to try to convince me about something about history. You also need to have good supporting evidence. There needs to be references to primary and secondary sources throughout your essay and referenced in your thesis statement. Also, you need to have a well-structured essay. There needs to be an intro, a body paragraph, and a conclusion. The reason I mention these supporting evidence and your topics for your thesis statement. Your topics and evidence need to be listed because that helps to organize your essay. For example, I'll get to that in a second. A couple of things to look for in a good thesis statement to get more specific. To help know if you're making a clearly stated argument, is it something you can disagree with? If you're just making a statement that's listing an unquestioned fact or just summarizing something from a reading, that's not something you can argue with. Your thesis statement needs to make a statement that people can argue and disagree with. Also, again, the importance of this evidence and your supporting topics. They are going to outline what your body paragraphs are about. Once I'm done with your thesis statement, I should know what each of your body paragraphs are going to be about. For example, let's say you are writing about LeBron James, the basketball player. Don't know why I'm using that example, it just popped in my head. Let's say you wrote a thesis statement about why he's a better basketball player than Michael Jordan. Not saying he is, any of you old school basketball fans, but just for the sake of argument, you could say something like he's a better basketball player than Michael Jordan because of his passing skills, his rebounding skills, and his scoring. That outlines what your 3 body paragraphs in that essay are going to be about. So again, not only are you making a clear argument, I also know what your evidence and what your topics are going to be. And again, of course, your topics need to provide relevant evidence. It needs to be something that's relevant to the topic, not just random facts you're throwing in there to take up a word count. If you have any more questions about that, please let me know. In the meantime, I want you to do a little bit of thesis statement practice. What I have here are some thesis statements about my favorite movie, The Lighthouse, which I mentioned last week. What I want you to do is I'm going to give you a couple of minutes where I'm going to slide out a frame here. And I'm going to ask you to rank these thesis statements from the worst one to the best one. I'll give you a couple of minutes and then I'll explain my reasoning when you're done. Or when you're hopefully done. I actually can't see when you're done. Alright. Hopefully, those of you watching at home are done ranking your thesis statements by now. In the meantime, let's go through these from worst to best. Keep your rankings in mind so I can explain why you may or may not be correct. The worst one is actually number 1. The movie The Lighthouse was directed by Robert Eggers, the director of The Witch. That is a bad thesis statement because you are not making an argument with this one. It is just a statement of fact. I cannot disagree with who directed this movie or who directed the movie The Witch. That is nothing to argue about, so that is just summarizing. The second worst one is actually number 3. This one states that some people have argued that The Lighthouse was snubbed when it wasn't nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars. This is starting to make an argument, but instead of really making your own argument, you're just repeating an argument from somebody else. So it does mention arguments. It does mention something you can argue with, because some people would disagree that The Lighthouse should have been nominated for Best Picture. But again, you're not really making a strong argument for yourself. You're just repeating someone else's argument, so that's still considered summary. It's a bit of a step up from literally just repeating a fact, but it's not a lot better. The second worst thesis statement is actually number 2, when it says The Lighthouse is the best movie ever made. That is a better thesis statement because it is making a clear argument. That is something we can definitely disagree with. However, what is it not doing that keeps it from being a great thesis statement? Remember from this last page right here, I want supporting topics as well and evidence. So this does make a clear argument, but it's not explaining why the writer thinks that The Lighthouse is the best movie ever made. The best thesis statement here is actually number 4, where it says The Lighthouse is the best movie ever made due to its excellent acting, unique cinematography, and well-written dialogue. So not only is it giving a very clear argument, it's setting up the rest of the essay by listing the main reasons why it is the best movie ever made, arguably. So please keep that and these key of things in mind. These are what I'm going to look for when I grade your thesis statements. So keep that in mind when you write your first one for writing assignment 1, and feel free to run them by me throughout this upcoming week. More than happy to give feedback if I can. Now, last thing we'll look at before we move on with our lives is primary and secondary sources, because I also obviously want to make sure you're prepared for that when we get into this week's writing assignment. As I mentioned last time, and as is written in the syllabus, every single writing assignment has to have primary sources and secondary sources unless I state otherwise, which, spoiler alert, I'm probably not going to state otherwise. Now, we need to make sure you know the difference so you don't actually just accidentally just use one or the other. So, primary sources are sources that are produced during a specific time period or were produced later by someone who did live through the time period being discussed. So, for example, if you were to find a newspaper article on the bombing of Pearl Harbor, that would count as a primary source of the Pearl Harbor event because obviously it's either written by people who saw it or were alive when it happened. If you found a diary of George Washington, for example, that's a primary source because obviously he lived through his own life and lived through the Revolution. Oral interviews, importantly, are also primary sources because even though they weren't necessarily produced during the time period, they're the interviews of people who were there. So, for example, when we get to the Cold War, if you were to find an interview of a Vietnam veteran, that would count as a primary source. Artifacts and art also count. Autobiographies that people write about themselves also count. News to TV reports and radio reports count. Propaganda posters and cartoons definitely count. And speeches would also count as a primary source. Your other option that you have to use, so it's not really an option, poor wording, are secondary sources. These are sources created by someone who wasn't there, usually an academic are the main ones you want to focus on, after the fact of some historical period or great event. A couple of important examples. Your textbook, which you can see right here, Patterns of World History, hello, that is a secondary source. It has primary sources in it, which I recommend you take advantage of, but by itself, it is a secondary source. So if you cite anything from the chapters, that would be used as a secondary source. Journal articles from academic historians and whatnot, those are secondary as well. Most movies are secondary sources. history books, some of which I'll have you read portions of. Those are secondary sources. Biographies, websites, and encyclopedias also count as a secondary source. So, hopefully that basically clears up what the major differences are. Just remember, you need to have both for every writing assignment you do, unless I state otherwise, which again, I am never going to state otherwise unless there's some horrific emergency. So keep that in mind, please. Now, getting us into the content for today. I'll try and not spend a ton of time of all this because I already wouldn't spend a ton of time on background stuff, but you do need to be aware of the start of the slave trade, obviously. So, one of the main things I want to get across first is the differences between household slavery and chattel slavery. Household slavery is one of the names given to the popular forms of slavery in Africa before European contact. Chattel slavery is the term given to slavery that was popularized by Europeans and eventually Americans once the international slave trade actually got underway. So, again, slavery did exist in Africa before the Europeans got there. It was not a new thing, but there were major differences across the board despite all the different types of slaveries that existed in Africa. Household slavery is just sort of the common umbrella term we use to describe them. First off, one of the main differences. Chattel slavery is where slaves are treated as property. In household slavery, you still could be considered a citizen and could still have some rights and property ownership. Chattel slavery, that's not the case. If you're a chattel slave, you are property. First, racial versus non-racial enslavement system. In household slavery in Africa, the most common forms of slavery was to be taken captive during a war or to go into slavery because you went into debt. In the chattel slavery system, eventually, at least, it was a racial-based system. As many of you may know, for example, by the time of the antebellum period in America, if your mother was a slave, you inherited her slave status. So it was racial and passed down from family to family. I don't have a ton of time to talk about this today, but one of the main reasons that, and we'll hopefully get to this a little bit later, one of the main reasons that the racial system became so popular in the Americas, at least, was because of Bacon's Rebellion in North America. Just to give you a quick summary, this was when a bunch of indentured servants rebelled against the elite class of the colonies in America, causing them to fear these indentured servant rebellions, which helped to popularize the racial system of slavery because it helped to justify keeping racial minorities in bondage and would appease the indentured servants and more poor Americans. So, racial system was a big difference, of course. Crucial to the slaves were also crucial to the economy in chattel slavery, as I'll get into more detail as we get more to American slavery especially. Again, African slavery was mainly just the result of a war or a crime. It wasn't really a business. In chattel slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, as I'm going to demonstrate, slavery was hugely profitable, and slaves were traded all across the world, and it made a lot of people in Africa, Europe, and the Americas a lot of money. Again, the legal status was quite a bit different. African slaves under household slavery were still legally a part of their owner's family most of the time. Chattel slaves were considered property, could just be bought or sold. Finally, the ability to climb the social ladder. African slaves, it was possible for a slave to climb the social ladder, and in other parts of the world. For example, some of you might be familiar with the story of Joseph, or Joseph and the Coat of Many Colors, from the Bible. When he became a slave in Africa, for those of you who are familiar, what happened to him? These are my most awkward parts of teaching online, by the way, the awkward pauses. But for those of you who are familiar with the Bible story of Joseph, again, whether it happened or not, I know some people might disagree on that, but that's not really the point. The point is that it does demonstrate an instance where a slave was able to climb very high above the social ladder. Because if you know the story, he actually became the second in command of all of Egypt. So this just demonstrates, again, whether it's true or not, that slaves in Africa could climb the social ladder under certain circumstances. For chattel slaves, it was impossible for them to climb the social ladder at all unless their masters freed them, which didn't happen very often, or unless they escaped. So again, their property, they can't climb up the ladder at all. Now, one thing I want to focus on before we move on is to wonder why it's important to remember that there were a lot of differences between pre-Atlantic slavery and chattel slavery. Okay, well, I think there are a couple of reasons. One, some people do like to argue, and it is a fair point perhaps, that Europeans and Americans did not invent slavery. It was a very long-lasting institution. However, it is important to remember that pre-Atlantic slavery was very different from this household slavery. Chattel slavery did make slaves much more of a commodity and take a lot of the even humanity, you could argue, out of slavery. This was the first time in the world slaves are really being treated exclusively as property. So it is important to remember that slavery did exist before, but we still have to recognize and deal with the fact that this Atlantic slave trade did greatly increase the suffering of slaves and slavery all across the board. Now, to get into the start a little bit, I have to move through this much faster than I would like to, so please take more upper-level history courses when you get the chance. I'm not a fan of survey courses because of how fast we have to go through everything. So, first off, in the 1440s is when it's really credited it was starting. The Portuguese started exploring across the African coast for the first time, and eventually they came in peacefully for slaves to avoid conflicts with local kingdoms. Why does this be important to remember? All right, I think it's important for a couple of reasons. Awkward pause class that isn't actually here again. One, it does show that the African kingdoms were complicit in at least the early portions of the slave trade, so there is blame across the board. But it also does show, as I'm going to get into in a couple of minutes, that African kingdoms were considered to be strong enough for the time that these European explorers couldn't just come in and walk all over them. So it kind of discredits the myth we often hear that European civilization was immediately super superior to everyone else. They obviously did come out on top in terms of colonization, but it was not an easy or quick process. Now, main thing to remember from this is when the first trade forts were established across the African coast. They would make treaties with local African leaders, get slaves and precious metals while they traded, and African leaders would receive luxury goods, which would in turn enhance their status. Much like many of us today, they like to get different goods from all over the place to show that their wealth and their ability to acquire impressive things. So everyone initially got a little bit out of this Atlantic slave trade. Couple of kingdoms that the Portuguese found when they first got to Africa. First, you have the Songhai Islamic Empire, which lasted from 1460 to 1591. They replaced the Mali Empire after 1469, which you probably learned about in World Civilizations 1. They got rich from trading gold in the Upper Niger, Senegal, and the Black Volta rivers, and they manufactured goods, gold, and slaves. So this is one of the first empires you can see over here that the Portuguese were able to get slaves from. They also traded with the Eastern Sahel and Savannah kingdoms. For example, there's Kanem Bornu, 1396 to 1893, which was an Islamic caliphate, I'm not sure how to pronounce that either, which survived on trading ivory, slaves, agricultural products, and fish. Then there were also the Hassal kingdoms from 1500 to 1800, which manufactured iron, steel, and copper. Interestingly, South Central Africa, so these countries down here, were mainly removed and not really involved in the slave trade. There would be later conflicts between Tutsi cattle breeders and Hutu farmers, which I'll mention later towards the end of this class, that were exploited later by the colonists. One thing I want to focus on to make sure we're all aware of: why would these first kingdoms be part of the slave trade while Central and South Africa really weren't? Again, awkward pause for people who aren't there. Well, again, just keep in mind where these forts were being set up. See, this is out on the coast. The Songhai Empire has access to the coast. Landlocked Africa wasn't very easy to get into at this point, especially for these first explorers. So it's easy to trade with those on the coast, but we haven't quite gotten to Central Africa yet. Now, just to give a little bit of detail of how Africa was explored, the Portuguese were the first to really do a good job of it because of their sailing technology. They invented a great sailing ship called the Caravel. They invented the astrolabe and quadrant for celestial navigation. They invented modern cartography or map making, and actually had a sailing technique they invented called volta de mar. This is essentially where you would use the wave currents around Africa to carry you around certain parts of the coast. For example, some of you may have heard of the infamous sailing trip, which I'm actually going to talk about in just a second, where the Portuguese and other Europeans finally got around the southern tip of Africa to get to India. They used that technique to ride these wave currents around the corners of the land. Now, a couple of the more famous explorers, you had Henry the Navigator, who you can see depicted here, who was Prince of Portugal at the time. He financed many voyages across Africa from 1434 to 1472. He is credited with starting the Atlantic slave trade by sponsoring a voyage to capture Africans all the way back in 1441, and helped to set up slave sugar plantations on the African coast. So he was essentially the one who got the plantation system I'll spend the next couple of class periods talking about. Vasco da Gama was the one credited with sailing around that southern tip of Africa. He established trading posts in Swahili, East Africa, and reached India by 1498. Finally, the Portuguese also did explore Ethiopia and supported them to fight the Muslim state of Adul, saved them from a holy war in 1541, but the Ottomans did come in and take over part of the kingdom, which is a whole different thing we don't really have time to get into. However, I do want to focus on one little aspect of this, which is why does that maybe reveal a little bit about the motivations of setting up an empire. I'll give you a hint. It's a very important topic that's going to keep coming up, especially once we get into the start of World War I. Again, I'm waiting for answers that aren't going to come today. And as you might have guessed, shows that a lot of times the motivations for setting up these colonies and empires was for competition against competing imperial powers. Portugal wanted to set up this colony to fight a Muslim colony in another area. So again, empire is often about competing with fellow imperial powers, which in turn is only going to lead to more conflict, as we'll get into in a week or so. So, finally, the slave trading kingdoms. These are the kingdoms that are most recognized for being involved in the European slave trade. The Kingdom of Benin, which you can see depicted right here, gave the Portuguese right to build forts in 1487. They started trading slaves in exchange for firearms. Why would they want to trade for firearms specifically? Okay, that one's pretty simple. Gives you extra firepower, literally, to help you in combat against your enemies. That's another very common aspect that we'll keep talking about the introduction of Europeans into new locations. A lot of times they would take European weapons and use them against other nations that hadn't had contact with the Europeans yet. So it further increases conflict with European involvement. They also were one of the first to admit missionaries to their kingdom, and some of them even began to acclimate or take on aspects of European culture. Why might that be important, and what might it show about what might potentially happen in the future? Alright, again, that was pretty simple and highlights some of the impacts of colonization. It shows how religion is going to be used to get Europeans access to African kingdoms, and how it's going to change the culture of Africa, which we'll talk even a little bit just about next time. Also, it does show that sort of the origins of African Christianity. For example, as I'll get into in a little bit further as we go into the course, and as you hopefully learn about in World Civilizations 1, the northern tip of Africa was typically controlled by Muslim kingdoms. The southern half of Africa, once the Portuguese got there especially, was controlled by Christians. So it sort of shows how the religious makeup of Africa that we currently see got its start. The Kingdom of Congo and Ndongo were also very important kingdoms. The Congo capital, Mbanza, which was later called Sao Salvador, actually rivaled the size of London and Rome in the 16th century. This demonstrates, or why it's important, again, that African kingdoms weren't just small things that the Europeans could easily run over. They were very powerful kingdoms that lasted for quite a long time. They started selling slaves to Portugal in 1502. A few thousand would be sold every year. By 1571, King Sebastião I sent a colonizing force to neighboring Ndongo for slaves, salt, and silver. They weren't satisfied with just the bit of slaves they were getting from Congo, so they wanted access to more. This led to the War of Conquest, which lasted many years and decades, from 1579 to 1657, when the Portuguese would ally with a group of warriors called the Obangala to raid both of these kingdoms and capture an average of 15,000 slaves per year. Does that remind you of anything we talked about last week? Alright, yes, as you hopefully remember, this is very similar to how Cortez took over the Aztecs, for example. Take advantage of disgruntled enemies, and you can take apart a kingdom that much easier. Finally, we'll look at the Dutch and the Dutch in South Africa. The Dutch got involved in this by 1652 when they built a fort at the Cape of Good Hope, which is of course located in this southern tip of Africa, if you weren't aware. They started importing slaves by 1658 to grow the settlement, and by 1750 there were 10,000 Boers or Dutch farmers living in the colony. They expanded into the interior of South Africa and destroyed the Khoi cattle breeder society. So again, like I mentioned, these conflicts between different groups were taken advantage of by the colonists. Because of this, the Afrikaners, or the Boer descendants of the original Dutch colonists, would eventually establish apartheid South Africa. Is anyone already familiar with what apartheid means? I apologize for my allergies, by the way. A couple of pets around here. It's not easy all the time. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, and this is something we'll get into a little bit later in the course, apartheid was actually basically Jim Crow on steroids in South Africa. The racial segregation system in South Africa was actually arguably worse than what went on in America. And they got its start here with these Dutch colonists setting up colonies in South Africa and exploiting the ethnic groups which are already there. Now, last thing I really want you to look at is the legacy of slavery in Africa. As I mentioned, it's very important to remember that there were African kingdoms that were involved in the Atlantic slave trade when it started. Because of that, we're going to look at one of the most infamous trade forts that was set up in modern-day Ghana and see how they treat the legacy of the slave trade. So, let's see if it'll work. Again, my technology is not the best. I think it's working, it's just very slow. In the meantime, I guess we'll just look at each other through the camera. Isn't that fun? Alright, here we go. Let me just try to get my annoying face out of the way and see if we can't get this started. And again, I'm going to try playing this. Alright, the video should be about to play now. Please let me know this time again if you're not able to see it. If you can't, we'll come up with some other solution, or I'll just have you view these on your own time.
May those who died rest in peace. May those who return find their roots. May humanity never again perpetrate such injustice against humanity, and we, the living, vow to uphold this. Slave exit to waiting boat. As we walk out the castle, we all carry a lot of responsibilities. We are just going to preach against injustice. And from now onwards, we see ourselves as brothers. This plaque was brought by the National House of Chiefs as a mission statement of the whole tour of the castle.
What role did they kind of play in keeping this slave trade going?
The chiefs were there, and then this slavery stuff was going on. So people are of the view that some of the chiefs also participated. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that is why they brought this to show us like apology of what some of their predecessors also did. Yeah.
Alright, thank you for that. Hopefully you were all able to see it this time. Again, if you weren't, please let me know. But a couple of things I want to focus on. First off, why did he say that this monument came to be? Right, as you hopefully saw and or heard in the video, it was of course made by descendants of many of the people in Ghana who actually operated this fort and sold Africans into slavery. Most important thing I think to remember is the stated purpose of this. He mentions several when he reads the plaque. He mentions that it was specifically put there so that people who came could remember what happened and learn from the crimes of their ancestors. And he mentions that many people there still felt they had responsibility and so wanted to remind people and to apologize for what went on. I think that's an important lesson for many of us, because many times we find it hard to sort of reconcile the legacy of slavery in America and understand how to deal with it. I think this is a great example of how it could potentially be dealt with. Instead of just trying to sweep it under the rug and pretend it didn't happen, I think it's a good idea to acknowledge it while also taking responsibility for it and even apologizing on the behalf of what our ancestors did. It doesn't mean necessarily we all have to feel guilty. It just means we recognize that this happened and don't try to sugarcoat it. So, I think that's a very important thing to remember, which is why I wanted to show it all to you guys. Now, just again, quick final reminders. You have these key assignments coming up over the next few weeks. Please let me know if there are any questions, and in the meantime, have a great rest of your week. If you need any help, you all know where to reach me. Adios.